Hello and welcome back to Breakaway here on Dauntless Dialogue. This is season 2, and today we're speaking with Randy Cramer, another self-professed whistleblower from the Secret Space program. Now, Randy is a much requested guest here on this show. He stepped forward back in 2013, and he has quite a lot of stories to tell us regarding work in the Mars Defense Force as a super soldier. Randy, welcome to Dauntless Dialogue.
Thanks for having me, Adam. Happy to be here.
One of the things that I really like about your story and the way you tell it is you're authentic, you are open, you're transparent. You've even volunteered yourself to be subjected to polygraph tests, and unfortunately...
On multiple occasions, just to be clear, on multiple occasions, I have said it to anybody who has offered to put one forward. I said, yeah, make it happen, and I'll show up. And up until now, no able to make it happen. We're hoping, fingers crossed, that there's some people at Gaia TV that want to do it and want to make it happen, and we'll make that happen. But yeah, I have offered to do that on multiple occasions.
Let's go back to the beginning of your story. Take us all the way back. Let's get in a time machine. Let's travel. Let's do a 5 and back. I want you to take us back to 2013 or wherever you think the story should begin. And let's talk about how you got involved in this clandestine program.
Well, I was actually engineered from the ground up. So I often say, metaphorically speaking, that I was engineered or born in a petri dish, which is not so far from the truth. My DNA was engineered in a laboratory, and then I was assembled as a genetic sample in the laboratory, and then put together as in vitro cells into my mother, and then born to my mother and father to be raised as quote unquote by normal parents in a normal family. And while I conducted training sessions as a child through my adolescent and teenage years until I was deployed when I was 17 years old into a 20-year program into the covert military space program, which 17 of those was in the MDF as an infantryman, and the last 3 years, we'll call it, was as a pilot aboard the EDF SS Nautilus, which is essentially a carrier, a space carrier, which, you know, has a number of air wings on it. We still call them air wings, even though it's not air out there. We still call them planes, even though they're not airplanes, and piloted a fighter as a part of an air wing on the Nautilus for the last part of my career. So that's where kind of the beginning of that is. It's like, you know, I was engineered, I was made, I was trained, I was deployed, and then spent 20 years, you know, essentially following orders and doing what I was told, because that's what soldiers do. And then came back, was sent back. Now the kind of the tricky part that I realize for some people is a bit to wrap their head around is that I was technically sent back 15 minutes right after I left. So I was put back into a younger body, which is, I know, is a little weird for people too, that they can extract entire consciousness, your entire soul and spirit energy, and put it from one vessel into another vessel, put back into a younger body, back into my timeline 15 minutes after I'd left, and then woke up thinking that remembering and thinking that I'd had this dream that was like weeks, months, ages long. And then, you know, as you kind of do when you wake up and you have quote unquote a dream, starts to fade out pretty quickly. I got up, looked in the mirror, and was like, oh, I'm 17 again. And then my mind just completely repressed anything else that hadn't already been repressed by the memory. But they call it a memory wipe, but isn't a memory wipe. It's a memory suppression, so that you don't want to remember, so that you can't remember. But even though you have all these visceral emotions and images that can flood or flash through your head, because it's a pretty traumatic couple of decades that you have to sort out. And then quote unquote relived my life from 17 to 37 as a civilian, trying to put my pieces back together. And I've often said it was a 20-year tour of duty and a 20-year healing process. There was, I spent years where, I didn't want to be social. I didn't want to talk to people. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't like large crowds. I didn't like loud noises. I had a lot of PTSD triggers that took a couple of decades really to sort out. The fact that I can sit here as a even mostly, healthy and functional person is because it was a couple of decades of like really seriously intense healing work just to get to be functional again. So that's the gist of it. I mean, you're welcome to ask me more things about different parts of it. But the gist of it is, I was made from the ground up and trained, deployed, brought back, told to forget everything, and then had to sort of go through a major healing process just to feel okay. And then in that process, of course, remembering everything became very critical part of being functional again, because there was no way that I was going to ever function if I didn't process the traumatic memories that I was repressing. That is something I would like to say to anyone who's having issues with repressed memories. You got to deal with them. Like, there's no way that you're ever going to function again. There's no way you're ever going to be okay. There's no way you're never going to be normal. Just give that up right now. Give it up that you're ever going to be normal, because you're not. That's what you went through. You're not going to be normal. But it's going to take processing those emotions, processing those thoughts, processing those experiences out so that you can be a whole and balanced human being, so that you can have some semblance of control over your life again after having your life completely taken outside of your control for decades, really.
Randy,
So I would fully encourage anyone who's having those issues to just really sort it out and take it seriously. Like, it's the only thing that you have to do in your life is to sort out your shit and get it dealt with, because otherwise you're just going to end up a mess. And I've talked to a lot of people who are just a mess because they're having a hard time dealing with it.
Yeah. Randy, what more can you tell us about the laboratory that you say you were kind of built from scratch from the DNA up? Was that a government laboratory, military? Was it a private contractor?
No, it was a United States Marine Corps Special Section lab with USMC SS scientists, with extraterrestrial scientists and engineers who were helping with the process. Now, since that was before I was born, there's not much that I can say about it other than what I've been told about it. So all I can say is the lab operated by United States Marine Corps Special Section staff at a USMC SS facility with the help of extraterrestrial scientists and genetic engineers, not just to make me, but there was, a 300 personnel list for the project that I was a part of when I was a kid. And so they were engineering myself and 299 other, what would be boys and girls, to go into that training program at the time. It was about a 3 or 4 year process, from what I understand, of sort of like engineering and building up that many different individuals, and then inserting them into mothers and family units that they could then be raised, quote unquote, normally, and then be escorted out from time to time for training purposes.
So let me just get that straight. So what do you know about the family you were raised with? Were they in the military? How were they assigned?
My parents are normal, what I would call normal working class folk, who came from a pretty standard kind of traditional religious background. So I got, raised in a Christian church and taught a lot of Bible-based values, and, raised to have a moral and ethical center, around that, to sort of believe in good and evil and to choose good over evil. And yeah, that was really it. I mean, there was nothing military or extraordinary in that sense about my family. My understanding is they're picking and choosing people based on different genetic markers from different ancestral genes that are present in that family. So they want building blocks from that family that they can build upon. They don't want to just take any blank slate and build up on it. They want to take something that has certain fundamentals that they want to start with, and then they add on to that.
But that family was unaware of your background, correct?
I'm sorry, say again?
But that family that you were raised by was unaware of your background, correct?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, for a lot of years, when I actually did my first interview back in 2013, it wasn't long, maybe a couple months after that, when I realized, ooh, if I don't tell my parents, like someone's going to tell them, they're going to hear it from somebody, and I'd rather they heard it from me. So I actually went over to see my folks and brought my whiteboard and my laptop and gave them like a 3-hour briefing on everything that I could conceive of. And they were, to be honest, I was not expecting them to be as supportive as they are and as they were at that time and continue to be. I would expect them to be a little shocked and dismayed and possibly even in denial about the whole thing, but they were actually really wonderful. And I think it explained a lot, actually. I think it actually filled in a lot of gaps for them that, you know, they always knew I was a special kid and always knew that I was a little different in a good way. So always super smart, always super creative, always super capable of a lot of different things. And that just put a context for them, I think, that helped it make sense. And so they've been incredibly supportive, and they're great, loving parents. I love them to pieces. They're fabulous human beings. I wouldn't be a decent, good person without them. So I owe my parents for raising me to be a decent, good person.
Okay, and I just wanted to say, Randy, before we got started, we had a crystal clear connection, and your audio is a little bit muffled now. Hopefully, it's just the way you're holding it. I don't know if there's interference or a bad connection, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. So hopefully it records it clearly.
Does that help at all?
A little bit, not really, not a whole lot.
Okay, hold on, let me try again.
So let me push the story along here. So, okay, so you're born and bred in a laboratory, so to speak. You're passed off to an adoptive family, and at what point are you then?
Oh, no, but they're biological family. No, they're my absolute biological family, biological parents, biological siblings. Absolutely part of my genetic heritage and my genetic family for sure.
Okay, I missed that point.
Genetic aspects from my mother, genetic aspects from my father were the building blocks to start with. So they didn't just make some random person and give them to my parents and go, here's a kid that you have nothing to do with. No, the building blocks to my genetic building blocks definitely come from my biological parents.
Okay, and were you recruited by the MyLab program or some other program?
Recruited really isn't the right word because I was engineered from the ground up. So, my DNA somewhere has a patent on it and it's technically listed as military hardware. And, because I was part of a United States Marine Corps Special Section project, I've been a Marine since I was a baby. So that's really where I started. And there was really no recruiting process or assimilation process. I was in the program from, before I breathed air outside my mother's womb.
Okay. So then let's step forward into the either your first time leaving the planet, or at what point would you say is the most significant first step in this story towards the secret space program aspect of your experience?
Well, I mean, the years of, childhood and adolescent training is the foundation that everybody who's in such a program gets. You get a pretty deep foundation mentally, physically, emotionally, and psychologically in certain training, just basic military training to be conditioned to do military things and to think and to fight and to shoot and to, work as a team and be organized as a group. That's all pretty straightforward. But really probably the most significant beginning to that point was my deployment when I was 17, which was a trip to the moon via TR-3B, which is the Black Triangle ships that we have, and then a processing at Luna Operations Command, which then turned into a deployment soon after that. So anyone who's let's get an itchy nose here. Anyone who's ever been in the military knows that you go to an induction center, and at that induction center, you get a physical, you get a psych eval, you file some paperwork, you sign some papers, you initial, sign, initial, and sign, and then you get deployed, you get put on a bus or a plane and sent to your duty station. It's no different other than that the processing center is on the moon, and that instead of putting you on a bus or a plane, they put you on a ship, on a space traveling ship with your paperwork, and then send you off to your duty station that way. So it's still essentially the same procedure, just different technology, and a little more outlandish locations are present in that storyline. So spent a couple of days at the induction center, and then put on a pretty large vehicle of transport that I'm guessing, based on the number of people that were on the one floor that I was on, and then the approximate number of floors that it would have had, being maybe 5 stories tall or something like that. But there could have been anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 personnel on that vehicle that were deployed at that time. I don't know. I don't know if every chair was filled on every floor. All I know is a bunch of people were in line to get on, and a bunch of people were in line to get off. And they took us through a jump gate from the lunar orbit to the Mars orbit, and then brought us down to the tarmac at Air Primus, which is the headquarters, military headquarters for the Mars Defense Force, the MCC, which is the Mars Colony Corporation, and headquarters for the colonies, which I've never been to. People have asked me about that before. I've never been to the colonies. I know some information about them, but we were pretty much, stationed a distance away and told to keep anything that might be coming from outside the perimeter towards the inside of the perimeter out to protect the colonies. Whether that was really true or not is subjective, I suppose. But I've never been to the colonies personally themselves, so I don't know too much about them from a personal firsthand experience, because I was just never there.
Okay, let me interject. So regarding the Mars Colony Corporation, were you given any history behind it? When it incorporated, when they first touched down, who was behind it, that sort of thing?
Not at the time. I've been informed later that the MCC was formed in the early 1970s, and that the first colonies were probably put down at about 1975, and that it's essentially a group of a combination of financiers, military contractors, and civilian administrators, military administrators, to administer the formation of colonies, which were supposed to have a certain number of people, grow in personnel by people having kids and raising them within the colony. And then the colonies themselves have some form of financial independence or stability, where they're supposed to be manufacturing, mining, or doing something that makes them profitable. You can't just have a colony that's, sucking resources out and going nowhere. So at some point, the goal is to have them be completely financially self-sufficient, or at least be producing something so that they're able to financially fund themselves. But again, those are details I'm not as precise upon, because it's not my area as maybe some other people might be. But
if you had to speculate, would you say that it was like an American corporation?
I would say a multinational cooperative, meaning that it wasn't just Americans. It was definitely Americans and what would at the time have been members of the Soviet Union and other major countries that were kind of sort of what used to be the old G8 would be kind of the countries that I would consider were at the majority of countries who were on those lists participating at that time, because they were the only countries that were financially and technologically advanced enough to be able to do so, and had personnel who were capable and trained and intelligent enough to be able to serve and function within those systems. So it was multinational.
And what was the kind of briefing that you received, if any, before first stepping foot on Lunar Operations Command or on Mars? Were you told you were going to be taken there? Were you told you were going to go through a jump gate? Were you given preparations? I know that you were trained, but were those trainings specific, or were they more general, and then you were sort of surprised by that next step?
They're very general in the sense that I wasn't surprised. I knew to expect a deployment. I knew to expect a lot of what quote unquote weird shit as far as advanced technology or potential of presence of extraterrestrial beings or exotic locations, exotic technologies. That was all, in the training. So I wasn't surprised by any of that, but I was not informed at all where we were going, what we were doing. In fact, when I signed my paperwork, my contract, one of the first things that I asked the officer who I was communicating with, sitting at the table with while he was presenting the information, I had to get an initial sign, was like, well, where am I going? And he was like, well, I can't tell you that right now. What you have to do is sign all of this, and then, we'll put it in your packet, and then you'll be informed of that at the right time. So we weren't even informed when we were on the ship, on the transport ship. We weren't informed of where we were, where we had arrived at until we got on the other end of the jump gate. Were orbiting in Mars orbit. That was when the pilot of the transport ship said, "Welcome to Mars."
And where did you deploy from? Like, where did you take off from on Earth?
I looked out the window as the ship was going from Earth to the moon, and I would say it was somewhere in the American Southwest. I want to say, eastern New Mexico, possibly western Texas. But since I didn't really, there are no lines on the map when you're looking down from the sky down at the Earth. Right. So you can't necessarily, if you're not really familiar with your geography, you might not know which state you're actually departing from. So I wasn't exactly sure where we were departing from, but it looked like somewhere about there. And then flew to the base on the backside of the Lunar Operations Command.
Okay, and so what kind of trainings could they have done with you? Like, you say general, but I don't even know what that means. Are you talking about like weaponry, marksmanship? Are you talking about like, are you talking about like intuitive empath training? Like, what do you mean when you say that?
So we don't have intuitive empaths. We have psionic specialists, which is just terminology more than anything. And everyone in United States Marine Corps Special Section gets what we call a rudimentary training in psionics. But if you're a psionic specialist, you get training which is much longer. So, the class that I took to train in basic psionics was about, I want to say 5 or 6 weeks, maybe. But psionic specialists do a program that's like almost 18 months or something like that. It's almost like a 1.5-year program. So if that's your specialization, you're going to spend a lot more time at it than you would just in general if you were just getting the basic fundamental training. But yeah, pretty much any military tactical training that you can think of, we had. So we were pretty much trained for anything, everything, and trained in scenarios, in mock-up scenarios in which sometimes drones were used as target practice, sometimes biological entities were used as target practice, which I can't say whether those were things that were genetically engineered or those things that we had an agreement with or that we captured. I really couldn't say. It was all very strange sometimes. But live fire exercises in what we call exotic environments or with exotic targets, which means, they often don't just have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. Sometimes they're really different. And sometimes the locations, appear to be about as non-terrestrial as you could imagine them to be. So we were trained for all of that. And the reason that we're trained for all of that is because there are 2 things that essentially happen when a person is confronted with actually being in the physical presence of an extraterrestrial being. And the 2 things that happen are that your frontal lobe goes through a thought process of trying to process what's happening, how prepared are you to have that experience, are you skeptical of that experience, are you just going to be in denial of that experience, can you go, oh, no, I can totally accept this experience. But what happens in fractions of a second faster than what your frontal lobe does is you has a emotional response, a really visceral emotional response. And so without that training to be prepared for just anything, 9 times out of 10, the amygdala is going to freak out and you're going to go into some kind of shock or some kind of psychological emotional distress, panic attack, or something. So even people, and I talk to people all the time who say, I want to meet an alien. And I would say, no, you really don't. Like you think you do. And maybe if it was an alien that looked a lot like you and me, and there are humanoids that look nearly identical and undistinguishable from us. And if you met one of those, you probably would be okay. But meeting an extraterrestrial being that's completely not physically like you think you want to meet one of those. But chances are the first time that you did, your amygdala would just freak out and you would go into a whole series of panic responses. Doesn't matter how prepared you think your frontal lobe is, your amygdala is going to make that decision for you. And unless you've been conditioned for years and years and years to anticipate exotic environments, exotic targets, exotic species, you're going to freak out. So the training is anything and everything military that you could think of, as well as being trained specifically for exotic locations and in exotic environments. So you end up on the surface of another world fighting some alien species. You're basically just like, oh, it's Tuesday. Here we go again. Because
right, and that's one of those things that we've heard from.
Adapt, and that adapting process can be really shocking and difficult.
Well, that's one of the things that we've heard from other whistleblowers discussing the future of disclosure for Earth is that we will most likely be first introduced to those beings that look most like us, that have the 5-star pattern, that mostly resemble us in terms of physical and facial features. And then it'll sort of be a gradual, incremental process of introduction to more different looking, more perhaps grotesque, more perhaps scary, different types of extraterrestrials, right?
Depends on how they decide to roll it out. And there's sort of 2 major, let's call them theatrical scenarios, because they are theatrical scenarios. They're not going to be what I would call an organic, natural scenario. So it's not going to be because somebody all of a sudden shows up and lands on the front lawn, the White House, and says, take me to your leader. Like, that's not going to happen. But if something like that does happen, it's going to be a staged event where a lot of people have talked about it beforehand, and a lot of people have decided how it's going to go, who's going to be there, what's the script that people are going to sort of be reading from. These will be very, pre-planned staged theatrical events in one form or another, because they'll be psychologically targeted. They don't want just some random, quote unquote, organic event. They want something that's psychologically targeted so that people can have the greatest potential to accept it and understand it. And the smallest number of people will have the smallest chance to just freak out and lose their shit over it. But there's sort of 2 major theatrical scenarios. One of those is a peaceful scenario, where some extraterrestrials show up, in our airspace, and we decide to invite them down, or they come down, not so invited, and we end up having this, sort of friendly conversation based on that theatrical scenario. That would be a scenario in which it would be most likely those species would look very similar to us, maybe a little different, maybe a little Gene Roddenberry different, you know what I'm saying? Like, some different facial features or bone structure issues that might, make, oh, that's definitely not a terrestrial human, but they're going to look similar enough to us that we wouldn't freak out about it. But chances are they're going to look a lot like us. Other theatrical scenario is hoax invasion, which then it's not the ETs that look like you and I that show up first, but actually something much more terrifying and frightening looking that will show up first in order to shock people into just get over it. Basically what we sort of call the shock and get over it message, which is instead of gradually getting people to accept it, you just thrust them into a hoax invasion of some sort of terrifying, monstrous extraterrestrial landing on the ground, across the news bands, splattered across, television and computer screens, to just get everybody to go, oh my God, like just have this complete shock and acceptance of being invaded, and then having some friendly ETs, again, who probably look more like us, show up a little bit later and say, oh, we see you're being invaded here, we'll help you out. And then, it's really melodrama. Anyone who understands what melodrama it really is, which is this sort of classic black hat, white hat theater, which is, the villain comes in twirling his mustache, and the guy in the white hat comes in with a big toothy grin. And I mean, that's theatrical melodrama. And it would be very similar to that, where you have this clear villain character who shows up, twirling their quote unquote metaphorical mustache, going, whoa, and, creating all kinds of havoc and mischief and problems. And then some really clear, smiley, white tooth, white hat figure that shows up to help save the day. And then that becomes the narrative in which we're able to start having this discussion, that it's not just in theory or on some fringe media sites or, in some internet access channels where people are talking about covert military space programs and extraterrestrial beings, but where it's actually on the 6 o'clock news, where everyone has to deal with it and everyone has to either accept it or decide to not accept it and freak out. But it's likely to be packaged in such a way that you have the largest percentage of people who will just accept it in one form or another. Most people aren't going to like it, but they will accept it because they just won't have a choice. And an invasion is one of those things where you don't have a choice. You have to accept it because it's happening. It's threatening. It's a danger. People's lives are on the line, and you don't have time to sit back and go, well, I think it's a hoax. Like, if there's, giant insects on the ground blowing up cars and tearing down buildings, then that becomes this visceral acceptance that people have to get over any of the other doubting, kind of questioning things that can happen in their brain. They go, well, I don't know if that's real. Like if it's really, if they're blowing shit up, then it becomes very real. And people just have to accept it and deal with it. If you have friendlies who look like us who come down, there can be a ton of skepticism, a ton, just like from every corner of social demographics who want to distrust the media, who want to distrust the government, who want to distrust what, leadership tells us, because there's room for it. There's plenty of room to be disagreeable, to question, because it's not threatening. It's not life-threatening. It's not endangering. And there is something about experiencing physiological danger, the adrenaline that people have to go through, and how that causes your brain to achieve greater levels of acceptance. So there is something to be said for a drastic, immediate physical threat that has the ability to get people to get over any of the questions, doubts, or confusions that they might have, because instead of the frontal lobe being able to think about it, or instead of the amygdala being able to just be shocked by it, the reptilian brain goes into survival and says, we have to deal with this. We just have to deal with it. And so the reptilian part of your brain, your lower cerebellum, kicks in and says, we're going to deal with this. We're going to find a way to accept this. We're just going to get over it because our survival is at stake. And so that's the two major theatrical ways in which that can be rolled out. So depending on which way in which they decide to roll that out will depend on whether it's this nice, pleasant, they look like us, we can be friends with them, or whether it starts out with, shock and awe.
Wow. Okay. There's a can of worms right there. And I just want to share a couple of my thoughts. I do agree that there is going to be pageantry and theatrics to it. And a lot of it's going to be pre-planned. It has to. And that's occurring right now behind closed doors. There's pros and cons to both sides of it. On the one hand, as Ronald Reagan once said, it would unify us as a species if there was a common threat. So in that regard, I think we'd let go of a lot of our infighting and unify. On the other hand, first impressions are very important. And if your first impression to the galactic community is one of a threat, then especially if it's like a certain type of ET, like if it's insectoids, then the human race is probably going to have a thing against insectoids, even the benevolent ones, for a long time, because that was our first knee-jerk reaction. But having said that, I'm assuming, and tell me if I'm right or wrong here, I'm assuming that this is what you're kind of hearing, because you do have your ear to the wall still. You are plugged in still. You're not kind of rogue. I do understand that you do have your connections and you do hear the gossip. So can you confirm, or can you tell us who's pushing for which narrative? Is there a group that's pushing for one and a group that's pushing for the other?
That's a very good question. And the best way that I can answer that is to say that it's this very complex arrangement of military intelligence groups, state operators, with executive branches of government of a number of countries, military intelligence branches of a number of countries, legislative bodies of a number of countries, who are all engaged in this conversation about how do we deal with this? How do we roll out some form of disclosure? Because we know it has to happen. We know we can't keep it a secret forever. We know that we desperately need the tools and technologies that are behind those walls of secrecy in order to survive as a species, as a civilization on planet Earth. That just has to happen. And that's enough conversations around the table. People understand that. What becomes the problem is discussing exactly how that's going to happen. And you have a lot of people who are, well, I don't want to do it that way if that guy's going to get an advantage and we're going to have a disadvantage. I don't want to do it that way. I want to have the advantage and, screw that guy. And so you have a lot of problems getting people to agree to anyway. And so you kind of have these two major schools of thought, which are, should we do it totally peaceably? Should we do it with the shock and awe of a hoax invasion? And it's not really so simple to say who's on one side and who's on the other. All I can really say to that is there's certain chunk of representatives from all of those different kinds of factions that I mentioned on one side and a chunk on the other. And I think it's fair to say at the moment that we have a greater than 51% of those people who are becoming more pro-hoax invasion because it just works out better for everybody. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody who's at the table making those decisions. So even though we could sit around and come up with all the positive reasons why we would want to do it peaceably, it kind of becomes this overarching notion why hoax invasion is looking pretty good to these people is because we have more infighting on this planet than we've had in centuries. And people just straight up hate each other. And I mean with a capital H-A-T-E, hate, to the point where there are groups of people who do not want to live on this planet if other groups of people are living on this planet and are doing everything they can to exterminate those groups, or doing everything they can to establish an incredibly militaristic way of existing in order to create conflict on epic scales. You have a number of organizations who believe that essentially they are ushering in the end times for their particular religious belief system. And that covers a number of religious belief systems, not just one or two, who believe that they are ushering in a moment when their particular narrative of what's supposed to happen at the quote unquote the end of the world, and how their particular deity or Messiah is supposed to save them and the people and their quote unquote true believers of that group. And so that becomes really problematic when trying to get those people to agree to something peaceful, because some of them simply will not. They will simply never come to the table and agree to a peaceable understanding with extraterrestrial species of a friendly nature, because they believe a narrative that is deeply ingrained in their religious experience for, in some cases, millennia, that they're not letting go of. And so we kind of have an agreement of understanding that the only way to get the largest numbers of those people in those groups on the same page is to have a common enemy. So, you can have groups of people trying to, jab each other's eyes out because they hate each other, or you can have them sitting around the campfire, sharing food and water. I'm going, damn aliens, and like having one person, one group of people to hate upon. And that gets everybody's focus together, which, as weird as it may sound, and I often find myself feeling like I'm in this strange position, being pro hoax invasion, because it gets everyone's focus on the same page, gets everyone's focus together. And even though that's on a common hate or on a common enemy, we really need that. We really need to get our focus together and on the same page. And that's kind of the only way it's going to happen. It's just not likely that enough of the social psychological demographics are going to come to an agreement if it's a peaceable landing of species in a ship that say, take me to your leader, we're here to help out. Like, there's just a lot of people that are going to be suspicious of that from the get-go. But if you have a situation in where you have a clear enemy who's clear the bad guy, well, then when the good guy shows up, it's a lot easier for people to go, hey, the good guy just showed up, because you have this binary dichotomy that's already been set up in the mind, which is part of our human brain, part of our human consciousness, of a villain and a hero anyway, of a good and a bad, of two different sides anyway. So by creating that villain side, it means that people are really going to be more accepting of the quote unquote good guys when they show up, because it's going to be very clear in their mind who the bad guy is, and then which is going to set up this position in their brain for, well, if that's the bad guy, who's the good guy? At some point there's got to be a good guy who's going to show up in this narrative, and then we can go, oh yay, the good guy just showed up. So psychologically, it's just more likely that's the way we're going to go, because there just doesn't seem to be a way that we can get agreement on how to get all those other groups together on the same page without wanting to just end the world, without as soon as they see ETs landing on the front lawn, or they see them in the sky, go, oh, that's it, end of the world. Let's all gather together in our living room, our church, our mosque, our enclave, and we'll just douse ourselves with gasoline and light everybody on fire, or do a Jim Jones moment and just drink, cyanide-laced Kool-Aid or something like that. Those are all very real scenarios. There's a number of real scenarios throughout the 19th and 20th centuries where that's happened, where you have groups of people who've decided it's the end of the world, and they got together in their particular building of faith or worship and locked the doors and burnt themselves to a cinder or drank poison, because they felt that that was the only way to get through, quote unquote, the end times. And so we're very concerned about a small percentage of those, let's just call them what they are, mentally and emotionally unstable people who don't want to accept a future, just don't want to accept a future in which their religious narrative is not dominant. And that's kind of going to have to happen. There's a lot of people who wish their religious narrative to be dominant, and it's just not going to be. It's going to have to take a back seat to understanding that we live in a big universe with a lot of species, and your deity doesn't necessarily have major priority over every other species in the universe. It may be something that has a priority over you and your life and your spiritual system and your people, if you choose to give it that, but it doesn't necessarily have any authority with other species from other worlds. And that's going to rub some people just really the wrong way. And so if you have a invading species, that gives them something to focus on, something to demonize, something to vilify, something to go, oh, that's the evil right there. And then something else shows up, they go, well, okay, maybe that's the good guy. So again, it sets up the dichotomy in the binary brain so that people can, accept one thing because the other thing is present. So they can accept the good because the evil is present. But if there's not really that presence of good and evil directly kind of defined, then people are just going to start dividing up on what they think is good or evil, even if they're quote unquote good ETs who have arrived based on their own belief systems of what they think should or should not be. So that's the quandary that we're really dealing with, is how to minimize the impact of mass suicide when we have contact, because it's not the majority of the population that we're concerned about. 85% of the population will adapt in one form or another. 85% statistically will adapt. It's that 15% that's a little mentally and emotionally unstable, that is just not ready to accept a reality outside of what they deeply believe. And that when that happens, there's just this very real chance that their reaction is going to be to self-destruct. And we don't want those people setting off a trend, which can happen psychologically, which is to establish, mass suicide trends or something like that. We just don't want that to happen. So we're trying to mitigate that in this process. And again, just psychologically, for the largest number of people, hoax invasion fits that model. So it's various groups of people on either side of that fence of what we should or should not do about that. And I just say that hoax invasion is winning that argument, because there's just a lot of things that it fixes faster, even though you have to break some things. I hate to use this phrase because it's a phrase that's often justified, allows people to justify terrible things. But if you want to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. And so at some point we see this way through this, is if we want to make it happen, we're going to have to break some eggs, and we're going to have to, blow some things up, and some cities will suffer tremendous damage of destruction and fire and human loss of life in order to make that happen. And that's sad. That's terrible that we're at the place where that's just the options that we're looking at, which is to never figure this out, or make it happen in such a way that you have people really divided, and again, turning on each other because they don't have a common enemy to turn on, or give them a common enemy to focus on, and that gets everybody off each other's backs, and gets humans, stop attacking other humans and trying to destroy other humans and annihilate ourselves, and puts the focus on trying to, keep everything alive and stable on planet Earth. And so it's a sticky wicket, as the saying goes. And I just find myself in this weird position defending hoax invasion like it's a good idea, just because, on the list of good and bad, pros and cons on either side, it works out. It works out better in a lot of ways, and it gets us down the field, as it were, faster, more efficiently than some other things. But again, it's not my call as how that's going to happen. So there's no way that I can say, this is how it's going to happen, this is how it's not going to happen. I can tell you based on the conversations what the trend in those conversations is, and where people tend to lean right now in that conversation. But when it comes right down to how it gets decided, that's not my call. So I can't say exactly how it's going to go. I can only tell you what the gist of the conversations and what the majority of people are, on the side that they're sitting right now, which is pro-hoax invasion.
Here are a few of my thoughts in no specific order. So yes, there's going to be mass hysteria either way. Having said that, there currently is mass hysteria already. The military-industrial complex.
And what a place to be prepared from. If I can interrupt real quickly, what a place to be prepared from, right? Where we're already facing just chaos and disaster at all these other points in our reality. Why is that not the most perfect stage for the next step to come in, which is like, oh, and there's aliens too? Oh, okay, whatever. Like it also, I think, is part of the stage setting of that event that we're in chaos. Because if everything was calm, it would throw things into even greater chaos. But the fact that we're already in chaos means that there's a chance for people, again, to adapt. So that was my interruption there.
No. It's all good. Who's to say that these military-industrial complex types who are sitting around the round table planning all of this are even in control? I mean, I know they certainly fancy themselves in control, but a group could come down, as you said, and land on the White House front lawn and reveal themselves. Or, it could be the Anshar from Inner Earth. It could be anybody really who says, you know what, the clock has run out. You've had your chance. We're going to kind of take it from here. Having said that, here's my personal take on all of it. If I had to cast, my vote one way or the other, is I kind of reject the whole false dichotomy to begin with, because I think that there's a third option here. Yes, we are going to project our conceptions of good versus evil and a lot of the religious dogma onto this situation, but I do think that there already is a nemesis on this planet, and I think that if we could reveal the various dark forces that have been committing systemic pedophilia and genocide and depopulation and social engineering and false flags, and if we could really shine the spotlight on them, we could unify the human race around a common enemy without having to look elsewhere.
I won't disagree with that. I will say that, in fact, there's some interesting rumors that's also on the table of options, and there's some things we're just gonna have to wait and see how they work out, because I hear discussions about, again, the pros and cons for how to get that done, what the obstacles are to getting that done, and whether or not certain people think that that's just really going to work. Not that it's a good idea or a bad idea. That's irrelevant to the conversation. Mm-hmm. It's more relevant to the conversation whether it will work.
Sure.
So, but I've heard some things recently which are, pointing that as a real possibility. And I'm just holding my breath like everybody else, going, really? Okay, well, let's see how that works out. So I've been told that if something like that is going to happen, we might actually see something going down within a matter of weeks from today. We might actually see something happening within a matter of weeks, but I can't say whether that's how it's going to go down or whether that's what's happening. All I can say is I've heard some interesting rumors, like plenty of other people probably have.
Sure. Regarding the 52,000 indictments and
exactly how it's going to work out.
Yep. Well, listen, Captain, you have my phone number, so if you want to put me in touch with the powers that be, I can certainly give them my take on how it should go down, and I'm sure they'll listen. Sorry, say that again. There's a little bit of feedback.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that.
There's some feedback. You're breaking up at the moment. Can you say that last part again?
I was saying, yeah, I'm sure they'll to you. There was a little bit of a laugh. Sorry, but I seriously doubt they.
Oh man, there's definitely some feedback on the line.
Security clearance. And so that just kind of puts you in that civilian with no security clearance. Why should we listen to that guy? But I respect the public opinion. I do. Yeah. We're sitting around deciding.
Randy, I think we've lost you. Are you still there?
I'm here. Hold on. That helps?
Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe that's a sign that we've reached the end of our interview. We actually ran a little bit late here. Captain, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I look forward to exploring your story in greater detail in the upcoming episodes here. I know our audience is very eager. You have been highly requested on this show. Today, we did a little bit of politicking and speculating about the nuances of the unfolding of disclosure, but I'm sure that our audience appreciates your take on everything, as I think we're all asking ourselves the same question is, yeah, sure, this is great, but how's it going to happen and when? So I want to thank you again for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I always do my best to just tell it like I understand it and be as forthcoming as I know how to be, and try and give people information that will be useful to them down the road. So, do my best.
Well, thank you so much. Join us next week in Breakaway here on Dauntless Dialogue as we speak with Captain Randy Cramer more about the layers of secrecy that are entailed to compartmentalize and to keep all of this under wraps, and how that layer of secrecy is starting to be peeled back, how the secrecy is eroding, and we're starting to actually see some push from behind the scenes to actually declassify a lot of this stuff and make it go mainstream. So we're looking forward to that, and we'll see you next week.